Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's event is hosted by the Committee of 100 in partnership with the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art. The topic is Enhancing Understanding, Chinese Art and Culture in the Museum. My name is Grace, and I am a Committee of 100 staff. I'm very glad to be part of tonight's event. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I would like to encourage everyone to submit your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen during the event. We will try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. Just briefly, Committee of 100 is a nonprofit organization of prominent Chinese Americans from the worlds of business, finance, arts, technology, and science. We have been in existence for more than 30 years with our dual mission: one, to promote the full participation of all Chinese Americans in American society, and two, advancing constructive dialogue and relationships between the peoples and leaders of the United States and Greater China. Tonight, we will explore the key role that museums can play today in enhancing public understanding of world cultures through scholarship, programming, and international collaboration. I would like to introduce our first panelist tonight, Chase Robinson, the Dame Jillian Sackler Director of the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery and the Freer Gallery of Arts at Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Arts. Chase joined the museum in December 2018 and leads the museum in a 5-year strategy that will expand its collections of the arts of East Asia, South Asia, and the Islamic world, celebrate its century-long association with American art, introduce new audiences and technologies, and foster an understanding of the arts, cultures, and societies of Asia. Also joining us tonight is Jen Stuart, the Melvin R. Seiden Curator of Chinese Arts at Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Arts. She became the first Melvin R. Seiden Curator of Chinese Art in 2014, and her main focus is on arts from the 10th century forward, with emphasis on ceramics, decorative arts, textiles, and court arts, including paintings. Our third panelist is Gao Hong, master Pipa performer, composer, and educator. She began her career as a professional musician at age 12, and later graduated from China's premier music school, the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. In both China and the US, she has received numerous top awards and honors, including the Bush Artist Fellowship, the McKnight Artist Fellowship, Sally Award winner, and so on. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. And without further ado, let's start the discussion. Chase, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Grace, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to spend some time with friends and those of you interested in fostering understanding and enhancing the public understanding of Asian cultures in general, but of course, Chinese culture and civilization in particular. I should also say it's an enormous privilege for me to spend some time with Gao and with Jan. Jan and I work closely together, so it's a particular privilege to spend some time with Gao Hong, who's performed at our museum, both in person as well as digitally. I should say that I join you from my office, but not, I regret to say, my office in the Freer Museum, in the Freer Gallery, but rather from my home office. We remain closed. We've been closed since March of 2020, but the very good news is that we will be reopening on July 16th. So I do encourage all of you who have occasion to be in DC or the area to come. Now, there's another reason why it's such a pleasure for me to join you today and our two esteemed guests, and that is the shared mission, by which I mean the Committee of 100, what it's about is very much what the National Museum of Asian Art is about, which is enhancing understanding, which is fostering dialogue. We'll have a dialogue this evening. And I should say, from the point of view of the museum, it's one which has been going on almost for a century. As some of you will know, we opened our doors in 1923, But Charles Lang Freer had been collecting art from Asia and China especially since the 1880s and 1890s. In fact, unlike many collectors of his day, he spent months traveling in Asia, living in Asia, collecting with his own eyes the masterworks that we're very fortunate to have in our museum. In that story, that founding story of Charles Lang Freer and the opening of our museum in 2000 and in 1923, China figures very, very prominently. Not only did Charles Lang Freer collect in China, but he bequeathed, and I think this is important and timely given our conversation tonight, a real spirit of value and collaboration and cooperation. The Freer Gallery of Art worked very, very closely as early as 1925 with Tsinghua University in carrying out archaeological excavations in which it was made clear from the start that the excavated objects were to remain in China. An English language report was made for publication in the United States. There were 2 seasons of really path-breaking scientific archaeological excavations. And I mention this not only because it shows the deep history of the museum in collaboration and cooperation with our Chinese colleagues, but also because we'll be doing an exhibition in 2023, our centennial year, which celebrates those great excavations, celebrates the enormous, important work that took place, uncovering Anyang and the story of the Shang capital. It's an exhibition that we're very much look forward to putting on, and again, very much welcome you to the museum. What I'd like to do is to cover, if possible, 4 topics. We don't have much time this this evening, but we've got 2 terrific guests, and I very much join you in looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I'll start with a very fundamental question. Why do we do what we do, especially now? I'll turn to how we induce people to engage with us. How do we capture our audiences? How do we speak to audiences? Then we'll turn to the role of context, in particular, the question of what I'll call cultural translation. And then finally, cross-cultural dimension, how we talk across cultures. So let's start with this question of why we do what we do. There's a long history to that, but we are living in a particularly fraught moment, a moment of misunderstanding, a moment even worse of anti-Asian xenophobia and anti-Chinese xenophobia in particular. Against a backdrop of globalization, anxieties, against a backdrop of pandemic, we in the museum world and the performing arts world take very seriously the responsibilities that come to us to induce understanding and also generate empathy and respect. So let me open the question, and I'll start with you, Gav, because you're our guest, as it were, just to reflect upon the moment we're in and the contribution you can make in fostering understanding.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a great pleasure to be here to sit with everyone. I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I came from China 27 years ago. When I first came here as a Chinese in America, didn't think about anything, just a musician, just thinking if I could just play for the audience, or if something I can pass on, that was simply just a music at that time. But very quickly, in 2 months of touring, one thing happened. I was touring 10 cities in New York City, Pittsburgh. When I was in Denver, the Denver Museum, and announced on the radio, say, please come to see the Chinese woman play the pipa. After 5 minutes, somebody called the presenter. How could this Chinese woman play the pipa? They were thinking I was playing a vegetable. So at that moment, I was very disappointed because the Chinese music is is 5,000 history. My Pipa is 2,000 years old, but not many people know. At that moment, I decided to say, you know what? I'm not just thinking about the music anymore. As a Chinese in America, I would want to do as much what I can. So then many stories just started coming. Then I located in Minneapolis. When I play, not many people even the American born, like the Chinese Americans, the children didn't know anything about it. So I started to thinking about what the best way to do is to promote the Chinese culture through music from the young generation. So I started very early in 1994. I started the first Chinese children's ensemble. Is from 8 years old to 16 years old in my basement, literally in my basement. But quickly just rolled very quickly. Everybody really enjoyed the Chinese music. So then the McPhail Center for the Arts in Minneapolis, one of the over 100 years old history, they took me as part of the community culture and the music to share. Then at that moment, I feel like I'm not just serve as a Chinese in US, I'm more like a server for the roots for the Chinese Americans and also for the broad audience. So then in 2001, I was fortunate, came to Carleton College in Northfield. It's the liberal arts school where very fortunately, and I started the Chinese private lesson first. Then we started Chinese music ensemble. Guess what? 2008, we were the first higher education in America to offer music major and the minor on Chinese instrument. So that's really is a break. I was just very fortunate to have the opportunities. Then when I started doing that, I really realized how many people suddenly started taking very seriously about the Chinese music. And then through the Chinese music, they started to knowing more about Chinese culture. So that's why I think it is for me through education and composition and promoting and preserving. And then also I have a privilege to perform at a Smithsonian live and also online with Jen, and Michael did a wonderful job to put that together. I'm very fortunate that that's my role. For me, it's not just a Chinese anymore. I think I more like my duty or my privilege to presenting Chinese culture and through the music.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. It's really extraordinary.
Thank you.
What you've described, of course, is this compelling intertwining of music and education. And Jen, in your case, there's a parallel, which is the intertwining of visual culture and education. I must say, I'm astounded to learn that the instrument you're playing on is 2,000 years old. Of course, many of the objects that we have the privilege of looking after, Jan, are comparable in age and cultural significance. But maybe I can ask you in particular, Jan, to speak to an issue that I think is really at the core, certainly near the core, of how we do education and research and how a museum navigates its responsibilities on the one hand to scholarship and to fundamental learning, but on the other hand to the public. And that is expertise, but at the same time, preservation of heritage and inducing sympathy and appreciation of culture.
Well, I first of all would like to say that it is a great pleasure to be here talking with both of you and reflecting back just on education. My own connection to China comes from education at a very elementary level. I'm using that word very specifically, elementary school, 3rd grade. So as a child, my town did not have any Asian Americans. And in third grade, a Chinese family moved into town. And the boy was, I'm afraid to say, bullied. And I had a very insightful teacher who taught us in class a bit about the greatness of China, whether it was inventing the compass or printing or paper. All this came out. And then we learned, of course, that our fireworks at 4th of July really come from a technology from China. I ended up becoming close friends with this boy, Larry. And that was just a first chapter of learning how integral Chinese inventions, technology is to our world that made me drawn towards China. But in my high school, I encountered a teacher who, an American Caucasian teacher, no Chinese background, but she had fallen in love with Chinese painting and was learning brush painting. And so I took up my first Chinese brush. Well, by the time I got to college, I had decided I was going to learn the Chinese language. I went off at age 20 to Taiwan to teach English and find out if Chinese culture was really my cup of tea. And indeed, I realized I felt very at home there. As one of my Chinese friends said, you must have been Chinese in your past life. And sometimes I think maybe I was, but it really became about scholarship, interest, and always being drawn to what you can learn about culture through the visual arts. I think an important incidental to this story of my taking up Chinese in college was I ran into that Chinese friend from third grade when we were in college and told him what I was up to. And he was astonished. And he said, "This is so amazing. I have done everything to reject trying to learn to read or write Chinese. I don't care about that language. English is what I want. And you're taking up Chinese?" So it reminded me at that point in my life, when you're about 20, that we should each embrace our own ethnicity and cultural heritage, but never be limited by it. And that's such an American experience, that you can be who you want by education, by what you do. And as I realized that the visual arts have a way of capturing people with exciting their curiosity and reaching their emotions, it became clear to me that museums are a place to excite the world at large about the cultures they hold, and that I could be a part of that process. It's a great honor because the Freer Sackler has exceptional collections. And one of the things that the National Museum allows for are so many international collaborations, as well as collaborations with our own curators. So I've worked with many curators, often who are Chinese, not necessarily Chinese, but I find that when you have these multicultural collaborations, including the one with music with Gao Hong, you often get the best product because everybody has their own viewpoint from their cultural background, from their childhood, really. And when you come together as scholars, we are equal in the depth of our scholarship, our research, the academic questions we ask, but sometimes we have a different way of phrasing a question, or we have a different sensitivity to an audience based on what we know from our past. And so that's something that I found working in our museum, we've really been able to take advantage of to display our Chinese art in a way that can reach many different people, but is always full of fresh research and deep understanding. Preservation is the other side of what you asked, and preservation is essential. I mean, one of the things is when you just think about China, just think of one of its early high points in the Tang Dynasty, when you have the Silk Road and we have Chinese goods going all over the world. the world as a whole, other parts of Asia, Europe, everywhere has been fascinated by Chinese things, and some are just preserved because of how great they are. If you look at the very old ecclesiastical garments in European churches, they often have Chinese silk. That's one kind of preservation. But I think, Chase, you know as well as I do, that one of the things that we do in the 20th and the 21st century is preserve art with a very sophisticated science of conservation, new technologies, new dedications. And again, I think it would be nice to share with everybody that one of the things we have at the Freer Sackler is the Hirayama studio that is dedicated to the preservation of East Asian paintings. Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. We have many different nationality people working in the studio. We bring to it great science and great traditional technique, both. So there's a lot to say, but I'll leave it at that.
No, but we've already developed a theme, which is on the one hand, the highly personal nature of what we do, our connections. As you know, Jan, my grandfather spent 20 years living in China, and my dad was born in China. So I grew up in a family. On the other hand, the institutional commitments we have, I can't resist asking Gao a question very quickly. What's the breakdown of your students? How many are Chinese, Chinese American, and how many are white kids or Black kids or other kind of kids?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, I do a lot of, besides the Carleton, I do a lot of K to 12 residency, or even some of from all over the American, all the colleges. Actually, I have a student who is African American and a lot of Caucasian, actually. But I would say about 75% of are Chinese people who came to, they came to America to study, and some of them was born in America, but it's a heritage in Chinese heritage. We'll call the ABC. And I have a Caucasian students who actually literally took the Chinese Pipa and study from me from Moorhead, 5.5 hours each way. Before came to Carleton, 5 years, his parents will drove him, whole family come for 5.5 hours, stay in the hotel, then study one night. I mean, the second day will go for 5 years. And then he came to Carleton. He was the first American who won the gold medal in China for 1,300 for Chinese Pipa player trying to competing. He was the first one ever to win non-Chinese. And now he's in the Berkeley, his name is Gus Hawley. He's in Berkeley University, UC Berkeley, to study ethnomusicology on Chinese music. So it's not really, it's about who are the students. Basically, we have reached out a lot of roots for the people like Asian. I have some people from Filipino, or I mean Vietnam or Filipino, whatever. It's all the different Native American. Or so, and I even have some people came to my Chinese ensemble at the Carleton and play saxophone, or of course the piano or clarinet, because for them, they say, I told them, it's not about what instrument you play, it's what's the music you're learning, then you experience the cultural background, the story through music.
I do find myself asking myself sometimes, what would the craftsman who made your Pipa, what would he think of what you're doing with his instrument now, the people that you're reaching with his instrument? And Jan, the craftsmen who produced the lacquerwares or the ceramics, what would they make of the fact that those extraordinary objects have been, are speaking to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in all sorts of ways that they couldn't possibly imagine? I should say that we have a little clip that we'd like to share, which shows off one way in which we try to bring art to different audiences. So I'll leave it to my colleagues in the background to queue up and then to play a little excerpt from an online program that we did. that was an excerpt from a series that we introduced now probably a year ago, Jan, called Look and Listen, which pairs typically musicians, performing artists with our curators. And it's been an extraordinary success. And I hope you got a taste of what it's like, not only to enjoy Gao's wonderful, wonderful musicianship, but also to be immersed in that digital sense in both the visual and the musical arts at the same time. Jan, of course, there are other ways in which we speak to audiences. You did a terrifically successful show a couple of years ago called, we call it the Empress's Show, and perhaps you can say a word or two about it. But at the same time, we've also been involved, not just speaking to those audiences who can come into our galleries and enjoy the exhibitions, but also we've been working very hard to speak to children. And this is something that, Gao, obviously you're doing very successfully as well. And we launched a program called Teaching China with the Smithsonian, which is an online platform. So maybe you can just very briefly give our friends a sense of on the one hand, the Empress's Show and what it was trying to accomplish, and then Teaching China with the Smithsonian.
Sure. One of the things that is exciting about museums is sometimes we concentrate on our own collections, and sometimes we partner with another museum to borrow their collections. And so we partnered with the Palace Museum in Beijing in order to create the exhibition Empresses of China's Forbidden City, 1644 to 1912. Those of you in the audience might laugh at the title. Why didn't we say Empresses of the Qing Dynasty? And it was simply, again, knowing our American audience, when they see QING, they wouldn't know how to pronounce it or what it was. So we used the dates. But it was an opportunity to show extraordinary art, to ask a very topical question. Of course, museum curators, directors are always aware of what are the hot topics. People were genuinely interested in gender studies, in women's history that has been ignored in so many places so many times. So through an interest in Chinese portraiture and then expanding out, and I say we because I collaborated with Daisy E.O. Wong, a curator now in Hong Kong, to create a chance for people to understand the rich complexities of the lives of the empresses and the top consorts in the Qing imperial court. Again, it was a fascinating array of objects, and it touched on some other issues that are sensitive to modern conceptions of the world. The fact that so many people know China, but don't know that China has a multi-ethnic heritage as well, and that the rulers of China in this last dynasty were ethnically Manchu, became another interesting story. So that was one example of hitting a lot of topical buttons, but doing it through absolute meticulous research about what these women's lives were like and showing the most gorgeous objects. Now, when you go down, and we had plenty of tours for children in that exhibition as well. But we're always thinking about K through 12, and we have specialists at the museum who work on education, and then they collaborate with the curators. And in this example, by working with people who are actually teachers and finding out what kind of information they wanted that would help them in the classroom explain China, we selected objects of many different media, jades, ceramics, paintings of many different topics, so that we could give at the level appropriate for young people the vocabulary chosen for them, but the ideas were there to excite them about how something was made or used or transport people overseas. And that's online. So that's a resource that teachers are using and that can be gotten through the Smithsonian, through our own website.
It's again, the parallels are very striking between the project that you're working through at the museum of fostering that respectful understanding, complex, grounded understanding of Chinese civilization, and what you're about, Gao. And I'd love to hear, and here I'm introducing this third theme that I'm interested in exploring. There is a challenge, and I think about sometimes the visitor walking down the National Mall, and when she or he walks into the Air and Space Museum, it's pretty clear what the museum is about and doesn't require a lot of cultural translation or explanation. Whereas when you come to the National Museum of Asian Art and you're introduced immediately into an aesthetic, which is quite different from the aesthetic that most of our visitors are familiar with, it poses certain challenges that we have to solve. Your Peapod anecdote is a wonderful example in which something you take for granted, your instrument, your extraordinary instrument, doesn't resonate. So what are the how do you handle that? How do you introduce what you do in ways that engender the kind of curiosity that you obviously have success in generating?
Actually, I think the put together multiple forms of art, like you just saw the video with Jen, put a beautiful art and with me play. Actually, I heard people say that's a wonderful thing. They receive a wonderful response. They say that feel like when I watching the painting, I suddenly hear the music, that I can see the music, feel like I can see, or I can hear the art, I can hear it. You know what I mean? And I think the multiple forms together when you play, like I play the like the monk with doing the wooden fish, that really bring people easier to imagine the monk how to chanting. So that was the other one. And also I do a lot of storytelling, because a lot of Chinese people even didn't know we have 4 different Pipa style, but one of my teacher, Lin Shicheng, is a Pudong style, who is that music is almost telling stories. So I will imitate, okay, here is a water sound. I will ask the students, do you know what the water sounds like? Then they will pretend I will play. Then they said, do you know how to blow wind? I just use the pipa. And I even can imitate the horse nan or the horse trotting. Even Chinese people talking, 你好吗? 很高兴见到你, or people laughing. So every time when I do that, if I play ambush, I wanted to tell them, say, listen this, dang la dang cha cha, that's the sword. You talk to, they didn't have a gun, they didn't have a other thing, so only thing they had a sword. So I will explain to them on each piece. This way, I will go through the beginning of a story. Then now I want you to listen. Here is the people screaming. Here is horse nan. Here is, so when I talk to them, even the little kids know that what it was. So I remember I play in New York City in the World Music Center. 2 an old lady came to me. One is a Long Island professor who was a professor teaching Chinese culture. The other one is Taiwanese. They both cried because they said, before you didn't tell us the story, we were just listening to the note. So like Chinese people, I can play Mozart, but that was a note. But when Chinese music, I always have a story. So I always explain each one about what's the music is about. When you talk to them, suddenly you feel like, oh, that's easy to imagine it. So that's what I do. I always talk to them, especially after the Pipa story. Even I play with orchestra, big orchestra, I still show them what Pipa song can do. Otherwise, they will think I made a mistake, because that's maybe she made a mistake. So I think that's what my approach is. One is to through multiple different art form. I did some media and arts together, like a multimedia work about a story. Sometimes I will have a storytelling, I will do the music. And now with Jen, I love the art together. I think that will help people to think, better understand the music and the arts together.
It's arresting that you play Mozart on your Pipa. And it's arresting because it speaks to that, on the one hand, the particular cultural form that you've mastered and that you're so effectively transmitting to others. But on the other hand, music is universal. As we all know, we are as in the womb, and as soon as we're born, we're attracted to certain sounds. It reminds me, Jan, of that parallel again. On the one hand, the highly particular forms, and like Gao, you employ a lot of storytelling by way of explanation, even exegesis of what are, to many of our visitors, obscure, arcane cultural forms, but at the same time, the kind of universals that underlie them, universals of beauty, of color, of shape, of form. That'll be my last question, so I'll put to you, Jane, just to ruminate on that. And then we'll turn to questions that are starting to flood in from the audience. Jan.
Well, when you're thinking of putting art together and on view to share with a public that doesn't know the background, you do have some challenges sometimes, and this is why labels are very helpful. So I think of your example of going into air and space, they don't have to tell you what the moon is, they being the curators. But when I have the audience looking at the most fantastic mid-Ming Dynasty carved lacquer food box that shows the Moon Palace, my audience might not get that it's the moon. The Chinese audience sees a rabbit and they see a toad. Well, with a rabbit and a toad, where else could it be but the moon? But if you don't know the background that the rabbit and the toad live in the moon, so as curators, we're constantly trying to figure out what is missing information that will enhance the way the visitor can appreciate what they're encountering. And in fact, you have to tell a lot of people, Chinese and not Chinese, what lacquer is, how it's made. So we as curators are always looking for visual excitement, things that will really get your heart throbbing, but ways to explain it and situate it and give a context. So themes can be a pathway through. We like that. But, I've done some experimental exhibitions, such as juxtaposing a Mark Rothko painting with an early 15th century copper red glazed dish that was made for an imperial sacrifice offering of food at a temple to the sun. And there it was drawing on this idea that you mentioned, Chase, of common humanity. Certain things are common to all of us. And I think we're all drawn to color, and red with that strong, long wavelength is one of those colors we're really drawn to. And when I was looking at this fantastic, incredibly difficult to make Chinese glazed dish, I realized that the glaze not only looked like crushed raspberries and color variations and such, but it looked like Mark Rothko. Completely ahistorical juxtaposition, but one that I'm very sensitive to because of our museum founder, Charles Lang Freer. He said, good art should be creating quiet contemplation and intelligent comparisons. And his comparisons that he made himself with what he collected were typically unexpected and ahistorical. So I thought, if Charles Lang Freer could do it, I could too. And as Rothko said about red, its color is drawing out emotions, ecstasy, tragedy, and doom. Well, the Chinese potters were not thinking of those emotions, but they were thinking of getting a red that could actually symbolize the color of the sun and symbolize the red that was an important emblem of the Ming ruling family at the time. Just the last thing to say about this exhibition of what made it experimental is I put the two artworks on view in a room with no labels. You had to go to a separate room to read the text and to know, because what I was hoping for is that people would come in and simply react to red and weep with the beauty of the power of red. And I think that was just getting to common humanity.
And the effective, how affective the performing arts and the visual arts can be, how they can move and induce a psychological state.
Yeah, I totally echo. Oh, I'm sorry. I totally
Please.
echo with Jen. And when I do it, I do a cross-cultural collaborations. You know, I was performing with a musical meeting on the Circle Road at live at the Smithsonian. I would literally play with the Syrian wood player. I play with the Japanese. I play with, Indian musician. That's what kind of like a Jen kind of like I say the color, different cultures thinking different emotion, but we find the common ground. We had the same idea of the sadness as even doesn't matter we're coming from different cultural background. But when you find the common ground, you use music, you find their cultural through music actually much easier. Just like Jen said, okay, here maybe Chinese think the red is just a sun, the other people think differently. So I think the cross-cultural connection, like Jen wanted to be a modern to show something, I think we're so on together as I want to echo that. Sorry about it.
I echo it as well. I can't resist. We have a collection of Chinese instruments in our collection. I can't resist the temptation, and in this respect, I'm prompted by one of our friends' questions in the chat.
Yes.
Could you just enlighten us a little bit, if you would, about the history of the pipa as an instrument, and perhaps make reference to the extent to which the modern pipa differs from the ancient?
Yeah, so the actually the pipa, that's why we're talking about the oud player, and all came from the same region of the root is from Arabic, as 5,000 years ago. But when they through Silk Road, that time, from Handanese that time, 2,000 years ago, then they start pass on to here. But until Tang Dynasty, suddenly the pipa is more popular. The modern pipa right now you're holding up, but the old one is you're holding on this side like a Japanese biwa. So if you say, I really want to see how the Chinese pipa would like 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, just go to Japan to find the biwa. You will see how the pipa. So the big differences is during the 20th century after the Cultural Revolution, then we suddenly felt like we needed to add more frets and to make a more. Before is the 5 pentatonic scale. Then later we add frets. That's why I was able to play Mozart, or because you can just play da, 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 just like everything. So the big difference is Tang Dynasty's pipa is use a big pick. Now we use fingernails, and also it's different. Now I even play with a jazz musician, bluegrass, and you can with orchestra, everything. So that's because we added more frets. The history is only 2,000 years, but I hope I answered the question.
You did. That's it, and you've given us yet another reason to invite you back to the museum.
I would love to
impose upon you again. Jen, I have a question, and we're running out of time. But it's as you know, we work closely together, and I'm always attracted to questions that demystify museum practice. Perhaps I said that because my own background before I came to the museum was in higher education, and so the question is this, what does a curator do? I mean, you clearly organize exhibits and you acquire Asian arts, but what is the balance? How long does it take you to do an exhibition? What's the balance of your responsibilities? Just, it's a good demystifying question, what you curators do.
Well, curatorial practice is founded in studying objects up close. So your artwork, whatever it is that you're curating, you are going to do research. So you're going to do secondary research, and then on selected pieces, you're going to go all the way down the tunnel and you're going to do original research. So you may be pulling out Chinese documents that go back to the 18th century, or maybe earlier. If you're studying something from the Song Dynasty, maybe you'll go back to the 10th century to read a text. So you're putting together new bits of information. You're putting together information by working with your colleagues in the Conservation and Scientific Research Department. You may collaborate with a scientist to find out more about how something is made, or whether a scientific test will help you date a piece. So you're constantly working on research. But as you're increasing the knowledge base about Chinese art, you want to share it. And exhibitions are a great way. They're scholarly publications, that's part of what a curator does, but exhibitions really get these objects out in ways that you can tell stories with them. You can put them in juxtaposition with things from other cultures or other time periods in China. So then you're coming up with some theme, some narrative of how to arrange the objects, and you may be borrowing things from other collections. You may be concentrating only on your own collection, but you're writing a lot of text, you're thinking a lot, but you're having lots of discussions with colleagues, and including colleagues that can help make your text clearer and better, and make sure that you haven't written for specialists without thinking about it. So it's a lot of teamwork to be a curator, but it is based in a desire to research and fully understand those art objects.
So eloquent of you to put it that way, Jan. I'm going to leave the two of you very little time, but I will conjoin that that notice of very little time with a hard question, if I may, because I found the conversation so stimulating. Gao, I mean, how do the question is about accessibility. The question is about those with low or no vision, or low or no hearing. We have responsibilities towards them as much as to those who have the fortune of good hearing and good sight. So maybe just by way of concluding, just share some thoughts about how one speaks to those audiences as well. I'll start with you, Jan, and then we'll leave the final word to Gao.
Well, with the visual arts are also tactile. So again, you can't necessarily handle our museum objects because of their fragility, but you can use 3D computer modeling to make reproductions that allow the touch to tell people what they're like. You can also come up with facsimile objects to let people feel a glaze. So where I might use my eyes to appreciate that glaze, we can use physical things that are safe to touch. We can also, in this wonderful world of computers, constantly have closed captions and different ways of expressing the information, describing the objects that you might be lecturing about. So we're trying all of these techniques to reach people. And we want the museum to be exciting for everybody.
Indeed. And Gao, last word to you.
Yeah, I like I said, I wanted to pass on whatever I can do, Rich. With the, unfortunately, they can't hear the music. I hope some of combination with multimedia arts or they can see it and then hear the music or something. For me, I want to reach a different audience. That's what I like to collaborate with the different artists or culture, because this like for me is if I ask people just come to see the traditional, they probably never come. But if I collaborate with the jazz musician or blues, and then suddenly say, "Oh, I want to go," that's accessible for them to. And for me, it's go out to collaborate with the artists, bring them in to learn the Chinese traditional.
So we do have to stop. I want to thank you, Gao Hong. It's been such a privilege to spend some time with you,
Thank you.
celebrate your musicianship and your extraordinary reach as an educator. Jan, Stuart, it's always a great pleasure to chat with you. The two of you doing so much to do as I said in my opening remarks, to induce that kind of respect and understanding, enhance the dialogue between civilizations, between American culture, varieties of American culture, and Asian and especially Chinese culture. So I want to thank you both very much. I thank our audience for being so attentive and for asking such terrific questions. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Jen. Beautiful.
Thank you, and thank the audience, and thank God that there are museums.
Yes.